Hi Sugar Snaps. I love flowers and I love being able to have flowers in my house in the summer from my own garden or someone else's garden. And what better way to combine a love of basket weaving and a love of flowers than creating a flower basket vase. I have here a larger size. This you could put a jar inside and have your flowers coming out of the top, just like you would using a vase. You can use a plastic container or a recycled jar or even a mason jar in your basket, and then have your water in it and have a beautiful bouquet of flowers. So today I'm going to make a smaller version of this basket so that it will fit a mason jar. So the materials and tools that you will need include a measuring tape, just a cloth measuring tape, a pair of basket shears. These are short bladed shears that make cutting reed really easy. A couple plastic clamps, some metal clamps. You'll want a pocket knife or some sort of utility knife. Straight tip packer. This is a flat-ended awl basically. A pencil and a stake weight, and this is a heavy weight that you put on your basket stakes to hold them in place so that when you're weaving they don't move around. And then also you'll want a bottle of water. This is a spray bottle of water, and a bin. This is kind of like a wash tub with water in it to soak your reed so that it makes it more pliable. For the reed, you'll need some 1/2 inch flat reed for the stakes, 5/8 inch flat oval for the rim, 1/4 inch wide flat oval for weavers and as well as the lashing. I've got a couple more pieces of the 1/2 inch flat reed for weaving, a piece of #1 round reed, and a piece of seagrass. And I'll show you how to use all these different pieces as we build the basket. The first step to weaving a basket is to cut the stakes, and those are the pieces that will build the walls and the bottom of the basket or the base of the basket. So for this basket, we're going to be using 8 25-inch stakes. So I have the 1/2 inch flat reed here, and I'm going to cut my stake by laying out a piece of the reed, this 1/2 inch flat reed, and measuring it against the measuring tape here, like so. So I'll lay it down, measure it out to 25, hold my measuring tape in place, and then bring my clippers or my scissors here and cut the stake. So I have a 25-inch long stake. Now for each of your stakes, you're gonna want to cut 8 of these. For each of them, you're going to put a mark in the center of the stake. And we want to do that on the wrong side of the reed. One side is slightly smoother and the other side is rougher and has more hairs coming off of it. The rougher side is the wrong side. That's the side that we'll be weaving into the basket. So inside here, that would be the wrong side. The outside will be the right side. So kind of like when you're sewing and you put right sides together, if that makes sense. So go ahead and use your tape measure again, just like you did for the cutting the stakes out. And for 25 inches, we're gonna do 12.5 inches, that's halfway. And I'll take my pencil and put a little hash mark at 12.5 so that I know where the center is. And check each of your stakes to do this by feeling both sides, and the side that is smoother, put that face down and put your mark on the side that's rougher. So do that for each of your 8 stakes. When your stakes are cut and marked, you'll put them in the water, dunk them in your water bin to allow them to soften. This will make them more pliable and help them to not crack as you're working. You don't want cracked stakes or you have to start over. The next thing to do is to lay out the base. And we're using 8 stakes, so we're gonna do 4 in one direction and 4 in the other. So I'm going to lay them on my surface, lining them up with about a stake's width between, lining up the marks here in the center. So I'll lay out 4 stakes in this direction, and I'm using my hand to hold them in place. And then I'll bring my stake weight and place it on those stakes to hold everything in place. And then we're working with 4 stakes going the other direction. So on this center mark, we're gonna use that and put a stake on either side of that center mark and then 2 other stakes. So I'll come in here and do an over, under pattern. So over this first one, under the second one, under this, or over this one and under this one. If you're working with an odd number of stakes, then the center mark would be under or in the middle of a stake here. But because we're using an even number, the center will actually be between 2 stakes. So we have 2 on either side and then a center mark right here. And we're kind of off center from these marks going horizontally because of the even stakes. So then I'll put another stake, making sure I bring the center mark facing up, and I'm going to weave this opposite. This stake is over on this one. I'm gonna go under and then over this one, under and over. So I'm weaving opposite of the first stake so that I end up holding those stakes in place with a weaving pattern. Now switch sides with your stake, weave the other side, going under and then over and then under and then over, like so, coming just to the side of those center marks. And then our last stake we'll put in here next to it, or next to what we've already woven. So you end up with a small square here in the center of your stakes, and this will be the base of your basket. Now I want to be able to fit a mason jar into this basket. So for this size basket, it's a little bit bigger than what a mason jar would fit. And so I want to make this one just a little bit smaller, but big enough to fit a mason jar. So you can test this by placing a mason jar there in the middle, or using your measuring tape to adjust the stakes until you have the right size. I'll grab my measuring tape and my jar of flowers that I want to use this basket for, and I'll put the mason jar right here in the center and extend out the sides just enough so that there's about 1/4 of an inch on either side extra with the stakes. So the stakes extend out about 1/4 inch bigger than the jar itself. So then, setting aside your flowers, put them somewhere safe. You might knock them off with the reed, so I'll move them in a minute. But then you will adjust the stakes here in the center so that you end up with spaces that are about the same size. And we're doing an open base basket. Here you can do a closed base basket if you would rather. You can check out these videos here on how to do open and closed base baskets. You'll just follow those techniques to create the base here. Your next step is the twining. Twining is a technique used around the base of the basket, so the perimeter of this base. You're basically weaving the stakes together so that they don't move around when you bring the stakes up to start to create the walls. It's kind of tying them in place so that it makes it easier to work with. And I have my round reed here, so I'm going to dump this in the water. It sometimes will need to soak for a little bit because you don't want this to break. You'll be folding it in half and then twining in kind of some small spaces. So allowing it to soak for about a minute is probably a good idea so that it's super pliable. Let's pull this piece out, and we're gonna fold it in half. So I have the ends together, and then this end I'm gonna bring and create a crimp. So I'm basically folding this in half. Gently, gently folding it. If you just go and crunch it down in half, you can crack it like that. You don't want it to crack. If you crack more than halfway through the round reed, then you're gonna wanna start with a new piece because it breaks down the integrity of the reed and it will eventually totally break, and then you'll have broken pieces sticking out of your basket. So if it's cracked less than halfway through, go ahead and use it, or try starting with a new piece if you need to. Okay, so I'm gonna take this loop, and this is the hard part, wrangling this reed. Take this loop and put it over and around a stake. Actually, we're gonna go over this guy. So a stake, 3 stakes in. So skipping the first 2 and going over the third. Now the piece of reed that's on top of this stake, we're gonna take over to the next stake, to the stake next to that first one, and bring it under and allow this piece that was going behind this stake to come out here and over top of this second stake. So we've basically created an X between the two stakes. Squeaky floor. Okay, now to round the corner, we're gonna move aside this piece of reed that's on top and bring the reed that's underneath and gently create a little bit of a crease to round the corner, and then bring the piece that's on top of this second stake and bring it underneath this third stake. So again, we end up with a little X in the corner. And try to push down so that the twining is right up against this stake here. So it's pressed up right next to it. Now, twining is always the piece that's on top goes underneath the next one, the next stake. And the piece that was underneath floats on top. So you're taking the one that's on top, bringing it around and under the next stake, and then allowing that second one to float. So basically you're just moving one piece of the round reed each stitch, allowing that second piece to just float over the next stake. And then around this corner, I'm gonna shift my stake weight, hold that in place, create a little bit of a crease in this corner, and a crease under this stake. And around. So just going all the way around. And if your stakes start to shift, if they move out of the way of where you want it to be, go ahead and adjust them. And you can adjust your stakes up until the point that you twine them, because once you twine them, they're held in place, which is the purpose of twining. So do any adjustments before you go to do the twining or as you come around to that stake. Like this one, if it's out here, I can tuck it in back where I want it to be and then round the corner like so. And here, this is starting to press out here because the corner's not super tight. So I'll come in and create a bit of a crease there at the corner and bring it around and underneath, creating a second crease, and then press these up against this stake, like so. And then underneath the next one. Okay, when you've come back around to where you started, for this basket, because the base is so small, we're going to trim the piece of round reed that's on top. We're gonna trim that down on the stake next to where you started. So the loop where we started is right here. I'm gonna trim this reed here, and the second reed I'm going to trim on top of the same stake that we started out on. So it ends up overlapping that loop. So we have an end on this stake and an end and the loop on this stake. And then set aside the rest of your round reed for your next project, and we'll move on to upsetting the stakes. If you enjoy making things, like this video because it'll help it to spread to other fiber artists. When you're ready to upset your stakes, you're probably going to want to spray them down with water to make sure that they're nice and damp and are super pliable. So go around the base of the stakes, the base of the stake being right where the twining and that base that you just built and the rest of the stake meet. So this area right in here, this is where we'll be folding the stakes up. So we want that to be nice and damp. Okay, so now you'll be able to move your base around and everything should be held nice and tight because of the twining without shifting around, which makes it nice for weaving because you'll be able to rotate it, move it around, as you're working, rather than having to like move around the table to make that happen. So upsetting, go ahead and press down on the steak against the edge and bring the steak and fold it over, so you're creating a crease right along the twining here. And I'm folding it all the way over to get a nice crease in that edge. Now, when you do this, this can break the steaks if they're not damp enough and if they're super brittle. So soaking them in the water is key to not breaking them. If your steak does break, just cut another one at 25 inches and go in and slide it into whatever space it came out of. You'll pull out the original and put in a new steak, and it's not a big deal. That's pretty easy to fix. So I'll go around folding these over, creating a crease, trying to get the steak fold right against where the base is. So we end up having the fold right against this edge of the outside steak. And then when you come to where you ended your twining, you'll want to hold those in place so that they don't fling out and get displaced. Okay. Also, if you notice that my cuticles are kind of blue, it's just because I was doing a dye project, not because I'm dying. Well, I was dying, just not physically. Okay, now the upsetting allows the walls of your basket to sit up straight so that you can more easily create the walls. If you're trying to create a basket that has more of a rounded bottom where it comes out and around, then you typically don't upset that those stakes for that type of basket. If you want nice straight walls, upsetting gives you that very defined bottom edge. Like this guy here, the stakes were folded up, and so we have a nice straight wall going up. There is some curve to the wall, but it's not as defined as it could be if you didn't do the upsetting. After upsetting, you're ready to weave the first row of your basket. So the bottom row of the walls of your basket. So I have a really long piece of reed here. I'm going to bundle up and stick into my water to allow it to soak. Again, you don't need it to soak for very long, just a couple seconds to make it pliable. And this is where you're gonna want to pull in your metal clamps. You can also use binder clips or really anything that will hold a reed on a reed. So your weaver reed to your stake reed so that it doesn't move around. So grab the end of your piece of reed, and I think I'm just gonna drop this on the floor beside me. If you're working with a long piece, managing it sometimes means just throwing it on the ground. Okay, so one side again is smooth and the other side is rougher, and we want the smooth side to be facing the outside of the basket. So figure that out, and I've got my smooth side here, and then I'm going to fold up the base of the basket so the base is against me, so it's facing me. And then I'm going to clamp this first reed right on top of a stake, and I'm going on the second stake here, right against where the twining is, so right against the base. So this bottom edge of the reed is right against the twining. And then we're going to weave in an under, over pattern around the base of the basket. So we are on top of this one, we're gonna go underneath this next one, trying to kind of hold the base up and in place. And then when you come to a corner, allowing the basket to create its own shape by using this stake to fold around and create a corner crease, and then rotate, reset your basket so that you have the next side in front of you. I'm gonna go around this next stake and bring around this corner. So this is the key point to creating your nice base corners, is how tight or loose you create this corner. So having that clamp in place means that it won't come out if you pull on it. Just don't pull on it too much. You don't want your basket walls going, eh. You kind of want to create a nice straight line. So a little bit of tension is good, making sure that this corner, you can press these two stakes together to create the nice corner here, where your crease is right there in the center of the corner. Then continuing to weave, so under this one, over this one, under this one, over this next one, and again creating a corner, and then turning. And here you can see my twining is starting to shift around and come out of place. I'm gonna try to press that down until I weave over it, over and around it. And here, this stake also is starting to shift because of that movement. So just do some adjustments. With larger baskets, the twining and working with the stakes can be a little bit easier actually, because the amount of stakes holds everything in place. This smaller basket, things are kind of shifting around and you're working in a small space. So your hands are also making it harder to work with the small space. Okay, so create this next corner. And if you need to, you can go ahead and put a clamp on one of the sides so that it holds that reed in place so that it's not pulling up the side of the basket. And then keep working around, weaving over and under. And if you haven't watched it yet, I suggest watching my wall hanging basket. You can find that up here. It goes over a lot of the techniques you need for weaving a basket, and it's a slightly easier beginning because you're only working with one stake for the base. This is working with 4 on each side. So I would suggest weaving that basket first and then moving on to this basket. But if you want to start here, that's totally fine. This is very doable beginner basket. Okay, I'm going to put another clamp right here. And one of the keys to basket weaving is having a lot of patience with yourself, not just with the work that you're working on, because there's a lot of moving pieces and there's a lot of things to be aware of. There's the stakes themselves, there's where is the twining, where is my weaver at? You're working with a long piece, so you're having to wrangle this thing that's draping to the floor. And so there's just a lot to keep in mind and hold in place, and it can feel a little bit crazy, especially when you're starting out. Being conscious of the fact that this is not an easy craft and you don't have to get it the first time. You can make a really wonky basket the first time and try again, and it will be better the second time. And you just keep working at it, kind of like anything, until you're satisfied with what you create. And that's part of the fun of learning to do something new and learning to, or just making in general, is the process and the journey. Doesn't have to be about the arrival, getting to the destination, in this case, the finished basket. I really enjoy teaching the process of the journey of making things, because there's so much joy and fun and so much to learn in the process, in enjoying the process of creating something, because you have the time and the space to just dig in, focus on something, make something beautiful in the end, and find some peace in the process. Okay, so I'm going to fold this corner around, pull in here. Okay, so when you've come to the overlap, typically in baskets, you want to overlap 4, so that would be bringing the weaver around and overlapping 4 stakes. But because we only have 4 stakes in the side and we started on the second stake, we're just going to tuck this behind one stake. So I'm bringing my weaver over top of the end where I started, so that's hidden behind, and then we're gonna tuck it behind this next stake. So cutting it to the outside of the second stake and then bring it around and tuck it in like so. And then move your clamp and clamp down over those layers so that it holds everything in place. So there's your first weaver. It looks a little bit wonky and your stakes are going everywhere, and that's how it's supposed to look, so that's okay. I'm gonna dunk it in here in my water bin to get it damp. And now I'm going to switch to another size of reed. You can use the 1/4 inch flat oval, you can use more 1/2 inch flat reed. I have a 3/8 inch wide flat reed that I'm gonna work with for some of the walls. And you can use dyed reed, throw in some seagrass. The way you build the walls is really personal preference, what size of reed you use, or if you use seagrass or whatever. This is the styling that's unique to your project, your process. So I'll get this damp. Each time you use a new piece of reed, you're gonna get it damp, just again, to keep it pliable. Okay, now each time you start a new row, you're going to rotate the basket a 1/4 turn. So we just finished a row on this side, we're gonna rotate 1/4 turn and start a row on this side. So I'll move my clamp out of the way. And again, you always start on the outside of a stake. So whichever stake the next row would be an over. So this was under the previous row. So this first row went under, the next row will be over. So I'm gonna clamp this to this stake like so. And then, so that's an over, we're gonna go under the next stake. Over this stake and under, and then reposition everything because it might have gotten or shifted around. Oops. And then create a corner again, just like you did before. And the next rows, you'll want to watch these corners because this will shape the base of your basket. You could end up with the walls coming out at an angle if you're too loose, or coming in if you start to pull in too tightly. I want the walls to be straight up and down to start out with, and then kind of pull in a little bit at the top. So I'm going to create a nice corner by making sure I have a 90-degree angle between the stake here and where my corner crease is. By situating the walls here like so, making sure these are straight up and down, and then making sure this reed has enough tension on it to pull in, but not too much tension that it like pulls in the reeds like this. So that's too much. This is too little. Here's where you want it to be. Okay, and keep weaving around. And move your stake or your clamps as you go. Move them out of your way. And as I weave, I'm adjusting these stakes so that they stay straight up and down. Checking the corner stake to make sure that's going straight up and down. Like I just showed you, if it's too tight, it'll start to pull in. If it's too loose, it'll start to pull out. So trying to make sure that's straight up and down. And then when you come to the side that was your starting side the previous row, just make sure to weave up until your clamp and then hold that first row in place so that it doesn't spring out, and weave over top of it, and this next row will hold that in place. Okay, and then turn your corner and you're coming back to where you started. So overlapping this first row and tucking behind the second, or first stake and tucking behind the second stake. So I'll remove my clamp and bring it over that end, create my corner here, and then cut to the outside edge of this second stake and tuck it over the first stake and under the second stake. And then clamp it in place because that doesn't want to stay. So the second row, I didn't put clamps in on each side like I did the first row because it's starting to hold its shape. You can definitely add the clamps if you want them. They are a nice added security, so just adding some clamps here to make sure that everything presses down and is where it's supposed to be. This will help press down your layers so you end up with a nice compact tight basket. So you could clamp it in so there's a clamp holding everything in place like so. Okay, I'm gonna do another row with my 3/8 inch wide reed. Gotta find where I ended, right here. So ended here, quarter turn. You're gonna start on this next row. So I'll lift off this clamp and start on this stake, clamp it in place, and then weave around, making sure to maintain those corners. We're just going to keep weaving away at the walls here until we get to about 2 inches from the top of the stakes. And remember to soak your basket in water as you go, or spray it down with your spray bottle. The stakes will begin to dry out, the base will begin to dry out, and keeping it damp is important so that the dryness of the stakes doesn't leave little hairs coming off. So watering it down helps the texture of the reed maintain a nice smooth edge. Okay, and then cut to the edge of this one and tuck over and under. Okay, and if you have a small piece at the end, you can measure it around to see if you have enough to go around for one more row. And I do, so I'm gonna start this one off, finding where I ended. And if you lose where you ended, you can just flip your basket up and you'll be able to see where the two overlap and then be able to situate yourself where to start next. If you're interested in more basket weaving, natural dyeing, or other fiber arts, tutorials, resources, inspiration, sign up for my email update. You can find the link for that in the description below. I'd love to have you join the Textile Indie community. I send a twice a month email with all kinds of resources for all the different fiber arts that I cover here on this channel and on my website. And I'd love to share with you the things that I find, the things that I'm learning, and the things that I've learned from other makers over the years. And every once in a while, check your base to adjust it to make sure the stakes are up against the edge, that your twining is fitting in where it's supposed to. I have a little end poking out here. You can press those into your basket, resituating them. Just gonna pull on the ends here a little bit. And each row that you weave, you want to compact down so that they're nice and tight together. So I'm pulling the rows down towards the base You can even pull on the stakes one at a time to kind of lift them up a little bit so that the rows are tight. And the reason I do this is because as the basket reed dries, it begins to shrink just a little bit, but enough that if you already have spaces between your rows, they get bigger. And so starting out tight will mean that your basket will have a nice solid wall without lots of space between your weavers. Okay, next I'm going to use a 1/4 inch wide flat oval reed. And again, the type of reed you choose is totally up to you. You can use flat reed, flat oval reed. I'm just going to square up my end here so that it's straight. I wouldn't suggest using half round reed because that's really, really thick and it'll end up pushing out your stakes. But Seagrass, the size is up to you. Using something that's super thick, like double the size of your stakes, can be difficult to manage because your that reed is really thick and chunky and heavy, and so it can be hard to turn around, turn the corners. So I wouldn't suggest using something quite that large, but you could use up to like a 5/8 inch or 3/4 inch, and it would just add dimension and interest to the walls of your basket. So size of the width of the reed and the type of reed you use is up to you. And you can play around with going back and forth. So here I'm probably going to do 3 to 5 rows of the 1/4 inch flat oval reed and then go back to the 3/8 inch. And so I'll have kind of a portion, and then do some 3/8 inch rows and then go back to the 1/4, so end up with kind of some stripes. And I'll show you this wall basket. You can find the link to this video in the description below, but here I use color to kind of add dimension and interest to the walls of this basket. This is 1/4 inch flat oval, or this is 1/4 inch flat reed, and then the natural is 1/4 inch flat oval. So they're the same width, but the color adds interest. You can do the same thing using the same natural reed, the same color, but just different sizes, and it still adds. And then every couple rows, you can go in and form your nice square corners by grabbing 2 sides and pressing them in, and then rotating and grabbing 2 sides and creating nice creased corners to build up your walls. Okay, so I'm gonna play some music and just get out weaving the walls of this basket. Go ahead and watch along, weave along with me, and I'll see you when we have 2 inches at the top to do the top of the basket. I'm gonna pause the music really quick and just add in some quick notes, some things that I'd like to just share. First off, being the fact that we started with a square and now the basket begins to round as you weave up the walls. If you want to maintain that square, make sure to go around and crimp those corners to try to keep that shape. I really like it when the base is a square and it starts to move into a circle at the top. So I'm going for that shape. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Another thing with these smaller baskets, a great way to use up your smaller pieces that don't go all the way around is to splice them together. So in order to do that, you're going to start weaving. Let me find my end here. I'm going to start here. Start weaving just like you would a normal row. So I'm weaving along, going around as far as I can with this weaver. And when I come to the end of that length, I have this amount of room left that it doesn't reach. So I'm going to end this weaver so that it's overlapping a stake. And just like we end by overlapping twice, we're going to start another row by overlapping twice. So I have another small piece of the same width and type of reed. I'm going to go under and behind, or behind this stake on top of that last weaver that I wove, and then finish off this row with this new weaver. And then overlap this end and tuck behind this second stake so that it's hiding those ends behind the stakes. So that's how to splice pieces of reed together that are just too short. You can test out doing really short pieces like this that will just go around 1.5 sides with other pieces. Another thing is that there will be little hairs coming off of your basket, and don't let those bother you yet. We'll come back and revisit those at the end of your basket weaving process. So I just decided that I don't want to go all the way up to where I had initially planned to end the stakes, because I just grabbed my flowers and put them in here. And if I go any taller, set them in there. If I go any taller, then we're going to lose the flowers. Like, they'll be in the basket. Because I'm using a mason jar. Obviously, you could put some stones in the bottom of your mason jar to lift up where the flowers are. You can use a bigger jar, whatever you want to do. If you want a larger vase, that totally works. If you are getting a bouquet of flowers at the farmer's market, typically those are really big. I would suggest going for a larger basket. This I want as just a small mason jar size bouquet. Something small that I can pull from my own garden or from friends' gardens. So I'm going to stop it here, which is the fun part about weaving your own baskets, because you can get to a point and decide, oh, I actually like it at this point. I want to stop here. As opposed to being like, but the pattern says I have to reach this point. You don't. If you get to a point that you like it, you can stop. And that is part of the fun of doing something yourself. So let's stop the weaving here and start creating the rim. And if you do want to continue to weave up until the 2 inches, which would probably be another 3 or 4 rows depending on the width of reed you're weaving with, you totally can. It'll be the same process to finish it regardless. So go ahead and keep weaving, or stop with me and we'll finish this guy off. Okay, so the next step is cutting and tucking, and that is a term used to describe what you do with the stakes to finish them off. For stakes that are on the outside, so that are sitting on top of the weaver. You're going to bring those over, fold them over, create a crease right along that top edge of that last weaver, and we'll tuck those into the basket to hold all the rows in place. So you're folding it over that top reed and kind of cinching it in so that the walls are nice and tightly held together. Now the reed that are coming behind that last row, you're going to trim right to the top edge of that last weaver as closely as possible. So any behind, go ahead and trim. Any in front, fold over. We'll go around all the way, the whole perimeter of the basket. And it can be hard to get these cut sections even with that top edge, but try to get as close as possible. Oops, that was a little bit of a crack. Keeping the steaks wet is good so that you don't accidentally crack them. If you crack one off, that's fine. You should have plenty of steaks to hold your basket together. If you break too many off, that could be a bummer. Fold and trim, fold and trim. Okay, now you have all the fold over steaks. We're gonna go into the basket and, how do I want to do this? I'm gonna stake these or clamp these down so that they're out of the way so that you can see what I'm doing. You don't need to do this. Okay, so I'm gonna have the basket set in front of me, and you'll want your straight tip packer for this part. You fold over the steak into the basket and we'll trim it down a couple rows down. So we're gonna tuck it behind the rows by trimming it down about 5 rows, cut it to the length that you want it, and then put your straight tip packer between the rows and that steak, and then lift them away from the steak so you can fold this over and tuck it behind those weavers using your straight tip packer to fold it in place, and then go to the outside to tuck it behind so you can't see it from the outside. So it's behind that steak. So it's basically folding over it and tucking over itself. Okay, and then this side, again, reach in, cut it to the length you want it, and then shove your straight tip packer in there and fold over, press in. Okay. And you can go around and cut all your steaks to the right length and then go around and tuck them in, whichever way is easier for you to see what you're doing. And if having the steaks clamped out of your way so that they're not, so that they're out of the way and you can see inside the basket, that's a great way to make this process easier. Okay, so everything's folded and tucked, and we're ready to create the rim. For the rim, you'll need your 5/8 inch flat oval reed, and this you'll want to stick in the water right away so it can start to soak. It's a lot thicker, so it'll take a bit longer to become pliable. And then for the lashing, you want a 1/4 inch flat oval reed, and then some seagrass to put inside the rim. And this you don't need to soak. You can just set this aside till later. Okay, so I'm gonna set this guy aside and grab my knife and pull out the 5/8 inch flat oval reed. I'll try not to make a mess. There we go. Okay, and tap off any excess water just so it's easier to work with. And now I'm going to trim down the end just a bit so that I have a straight end first, and then trim down about 1.5 inches into the reed. And we're trimming it down to about half the thickness. And this is so that you can overlap 2 thicknesses of the rim reed without it being super bulky. Okay, so there is one side, and we're going to start by making the outer rim. Okay, so set this piece of reed right on top of that last row that you wove. So right on top there. And this is where the plastic clamps come in handy, because they have a nice big space in the center here that holds the rim in place without causing dents in the reed. The metal clamps tend to create a little bit of a crease in the reed, and that can look funny on the rim. Okay, so now you're going to move your hands and the reed around the rim of the basket so that it's held tightly against that top row of weaving, so that it's nice and tight against the edge here. Okay, and then when you are ready to overlap, you're going to overlap that 1.5 inches and cut right to the edge of where that 1.5 inches of trimming down ends. And then I like to taper off the ends here like this by cutting them off, and then cutting off those corners as well to create a slightly rounded end. And then shift your clamp over so that it's holding the 2 layers of rim and the basket in place, like so. Okay, and then we're going to do the same process for the inner rim by trimming down 1.5 inches from the end so that it's about half as thick. And then placing it on the inside. And this can be a little more challenging. I'm going to move my flowers. A little more challenging because you're having to curve it opposite of the way it wants to curve. So you can even pre-train it by curving it around so that the rounded side is out. I probably should have mentioned that earlier. You want the round side on the outside of your basket. And then for the inner rim, you want the round side on the inside of the basket. Okay, so I ended that outer rim edge here. I'm gonna start and end on the opposite side for the inner rim. Stick it in the middle of a wall and then rotate it around the inside edge of the basket. Okay, and then you're going to need to move this clamp, but it's holding the outer rim in place. So hold the outer rim in place while you lift up the clamp. Set the inner rim in place and then put the clamp over all the layers. That can be a little tricky, but if you hold them together with some fingers and move the reed in with the other fingers, you should be able to get it. Okay, and move each clamp aside as you go around and place that inner rim underneath the clamp. And then we'll trim down where the overlap is, and then bring this out so you can even it out. Like so. And then overlap and set in place. And then you'll want to look at it and change the shape if you need to make it more rounded, and tuck things in tighter, pull in the rim. I've got a little bit of a gap right here, so I'm going to rotate it so that the ends overlap more, so that it's tighter together, tighter against the wall of the basket. And then press it up so that it's just overlapping that top reed without going too high or too low. And then we're ready to put the seagrass in. So on a side that you don't have the join, the overlap of the rim, you'll lift up a clamp and set this reed right into the space in between. And because we're using a 5/8 inch wide rim and the last weaver was 3/8 inch wide, you have enough space in the top to set that seagrass right in on top there. And then feed the seagrass into that space all the way around your basket, lifting up the clamps as you come to them and holding in any of the edges so that they don't do that. So you'll just bring them back together, hold it in place, put your seagrass in place, and then clamp them closed. And then here where you meet where you started, I'm gonna trim right up next to that other end of the seagrass and then clamp over them so that it holds that in place. Next up we have the lashing, and this is nearly the last step on this basket other than some finishing steps. So you'll be using the 1/4 inch wide flat oval reed, and this is going to be a little bit crazy to handle, so go ahead and drop the end on the floor, and you want to have one end in your hand. And now this, you're going to have to focus on where the rounded side and where the flat side is through the lashing. So I'll talk you through this process. First off, making sure the round side is up. We're going to tuck this in between the wall of the basket and the inner rim. So placing your straight tip packer between 2 stakes. So I'm working in the space between 2 stakes. I'm tucking in my straight tip packer here to create a space so you can see my packer coming into the basket. We're going to create a loop around that inner rim with the lashing to create a starting knot. So I'm inserting it into the basket, bringing enough of a tail up, folding on that bottom edge of the rim here, and then folding it back down and into the basket. So creating a crease and then creating a nice loop, basically a loop around the rim or a knot so that it holds it in place. And I'm feeling a little bit dry here, so I'm gonna give it a good spray before I start. Okay, so we're going to do whip stitches around this rim, and we do that in between each stake. So the space between each stake should end up with a stitch. So I'm going to create a space with my straight tip packer between that final row, which is under the rim, and the row below it. So creating a space, and then pinch the lashing reed between your thumb and your forefinger of your working hand, and you're going to pull it through your hand, making sure the rounded edge is against your thumb or facing up the entire length of the reed. So I'm pulling through, and you can do this quickly, just making sure the orientation is accurate. And the reason you do that is because you're gonna stick it through this space here and push it through so that it goes around all the layers here, and pull it through. And you might have to untangle it around your workspace. Pull through to create your loop. And I'm working with a really long piece here. You don't have to work with quite as long of a piece. If you wrap it around the basket 3 times and trim it down, that should be enough reed. Okay, so I made my first stitch, and the reason you did the orientation so carefully is because when you loop it around, you want that rounded edge facing up all the way around. And if it gets twisted as you work, you end up with a twist here, which could be a cool look, but that's not what we're going for today. So just making sure that orientation is accurate all the way around so that you don't have to untwist it once you've created the stitch. That is a lot more difficult. Okay, so my next space, I've gone into this space. Now I'm gonna go here, create my space with my packer, and then feed the reed through, pull it through, without lassoing everything. And then pull tight. And the tighter your rim, the better, because again, the reed does shrink once it dries, so the integrity of your rim will be a lot better if it's nice and tight. Don't pull too tight, you don't want to break the lashing reed, but pull tight enough that you have a nice, sturdy, tight finish here. And then pull through your hands, keeping that orientation. And now when you get to any overlaps, you can shift the clamp and put your loop through here in this next space. And we're gonna try to catch the rim piece and hold it together with this stitch. So I'm lapping over where this joint is, and I'm pulling tight so that I keep those tightly pressed together, and then bring it up. And I use my left hand or my non-working hand to hold this lashing here against the inside wall of the basket with this finger so that it doesn't shift as I'm running it through my fingers to maintain that orientation. And then I can move fingers and use these two, my thumb and my forefinger, to pinch and hold that orientation while I create my space, and keep that orientation while you put it into that space. And then pull tight. And we'll do this all the way around. And sometimes the spaces will be pretty tight, which is good because it means you've woven your walls nice and tight. But you'll just have to work at getting that packer in between the layers. And then pull tight. Okay, and as you work, you can form the top of your basket. You can also do that once you've completely finished. Right now, I've got an oval shape going on because I have the rim starts and ends on opposite sides, so it's pulling it out like a football. I want a round top, but I'll adjust that once I'm done. You'll just shape it when it's wet to get the shape you want. And sometimes working with the lashing, it might be helpful to sit down and just do this somewhere where there's nothing around you so that you're not grabbing things with the reed. Like my spray bottle or the tub of water or my tools or whatever is around you. If your end becomes like ratty like this, where the reed has split, you can trim up a bit so that you have a nice end to work with again. And that will help you to get into the cracks without having to try to get multiple pieces through. And I'd love to see your finished basket. If you want to share it on Instagram, you could tag it with @TextileIndie, and that will let me know that you wove a basket. I'll be able to see it, and I'd love to see your creativity and what you've created. Okay, so I just created the stitch in the last space, and I'm back to where we started. So I'm gonna trim down so I have about 8 inches of extra length here to work with, and let that fall to the ground. The extra fall to the ground. And we're going to create a loop around the inner rim just like we did at the beginning. So putting your straight tip packer in between the wall of the basket and the inner rim, and then folding this over, tucking it in and pulling down into the basket so you have an end and a loop there. And then we'll trim these ends down so that they're hidden away on the inside of the basket. So now we have that football shape. I want to switch that around by pressing in towards those sides and then kind of rotating until you have a nice circle or whatever shape you want. With this type of rim, it's harder to do a square top of your basket because the thickness of the rim makes it hard to maintain corners. But you can work at creating that corner by pressing corners in like so and create a more square top. It's kind of a rounded square, but you can get a bit more angle in there, or leave it rounded like this. And you can do a lot of shifting around and setting your basket in place. If it's a little bit off to one side, you can kind of press towards one side and get it to stand up straight. While it's wet, it's pretty malleable, and so you can do any shaping right now before it dries. And there is your finished basket. If you finish this video, finish this basket with me, I'm so proud of you. We did it, we made a basket, and it's beautiful. Let's add our flowers in here. Put our flower jar in here and see how it looks. Look at that, super fun. I'm gonna get a big full bouquet to fill it with. So I just have a mason jar here that I'm gonna set in my basket. You can use an old pasta sauce jar or plastic container. Even a yogurt container would probably fit in here. So any kind of container that will hold water, and put some water in the container, set it in your basket, add your flowers, and you're good to go. Okay, some quick finishing thoughts for your flower vase basket. One is that you'll want to let it dry for up to 24 hours. This rim has multiple layers and it's all damp, and you want that to thoroughly dry before you move on to any finishing techniques. So let this dry thoroughly before moving on to staining or sealing. Another is there are probably a lot of little hairs coming off of your basket, and I usually just go around clipping the bigger ones off so that they're not splaying out everywhere. You could try to sand them off or sand the basket, though that might start to break down the surface and make it even more hairy. So my best suggestion would be to go around and trim off any hairs. After you've allowed it to dry, you've trimmed down all the hairs that you want to trim down, the next thing is to stain and seal it. I have a post on my website about how to protect your baskets from mold, and I'll put the link in the description below. The reason I wrote that post was because as I made baskets, I wasn't sealing them. And in my climate where I live, there's a lot of moisture, a lot of humidity in the air, and they were starting to mold, growing some green gross mold. And you can wash that off with soap and a scrub brush, but I wanted to keep them from having to wash them regularly. So you can stain or seal it. Staining changes the color of the reed, so you can use any kind of wood stain. I suggest using, I think it's a Danish wood stain, comes in a spray can. I'll put the links in the description below. That's what I would suggest. Or using a clear finish like sealer for if you want to maintain the natural color. I definitely suggest using a sealer even if you don't want to stain it. You want to keep the natural color because that will protect it from mold. And I have a video on how to apply sealers and stains, so you can find that up here and in the description below. I suggest watching that before you do that process so you get an idea of what that looks like. And my last suggestion will be to sign and date your basket, because you can put your name on it, put the date of when you made it. If this is your first basket, you can look back on it as you make tons more baskets and see your progress, see where you started, when you started. I have baskets from 10 years ago that I still have around my house, and it's really fun to look at the bottom and see, oh yeah, I made that, and that was one of my beginner baskets, and it was not so bad. So that's a fun thing to do. Thanks so much for watching. Be sure to check the description below, because there's lots of goodies down there. I have several basket weaving courses that you can purchase and take to learn a bunch of the basket weaving techniques so that you can start weaving baskets yourself. Also, my email update list is the links down there, and like I suggested earlier, sign up for that, and then you can email me with other questions you have about this basket or basket weaving in general, and I'd love to try to answer those. I'll do my best to answer. If you have any questions about this basket specifically, you can leave a question in the comments below, and I'll do my best to answer those as well. So thanks for watching, and I'll catch you next time. Happy weaving.